Hello, welcome to Superintendents Roundtable. This is our last roundtable of the school year. I'm Deb Vinsel, the CEO here at Thurston Community Media. Periodically, we invite the superintendents from the 4 area's largest school districts to come and talk about education in our community. And we are so pleased to have them with us again today. We have Brian Wharton from the Yelm Community Schools, Patrick Murphy from Olympia School District, Carole Meyer from Tumwater Schools, and Debra Clemens from the North Thurston Public Schools. I know your schedules are busy. It's the end of the year and things tend to speed up a little bit, so thank you all for taking time to come and be with us. And I will note that 2 of our superintendents, this is their last visit with us. Brian is going to be retiring in June, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And Carole is going to be stepping aside. There's a new superintendent coming into Tumwater in July, so we'll maybe talk about that a little bit toward the end of the program. So thank you all for coming. The legislature, this is our perennial conversation, it seems. The legislature ended its session on time this year, which was a little bit amazing. They passed a $69.2 billion 2-year budget that included $2.2 billion for state and school employee wage increases, but I know there was a whole lot of other stuff related to education that was important. So let's jump into that a little bit. I guess I want to ask, did they do the job that we needed them to do? And what were the impacts? Special education, transportation, and regionalization were all part of that. So Brian, why don't we start? Let's just kind of go around the table. Please feel free to jump in on this. What's your general feeling about the legislature's performance relative to education?
Our general feeling, my general feeling, I'll just personalize to myself, is education did not rise to much of a priority in this legislative session. It was not the paramount duty of the legislature. There are some investments. Some will argue that most of those investments were mandated increases anyway based on previous acts of the legislature. Our group advocated really strongly for special education enhancements. There was an agreed upon, I think every legislator would agree that there was about an $800 million deficit over the next 2 years where school districts are being forced through their local dollars to supplement what's not coming from the state and federal levels. There was an investment made. It was less than half of what was agreed upon. I think it just is another act of kicking the can down the road a little bit. That theme may come up later in talks about transportation, but there will still need to be a significant contribution from local levies, which it shouldn't be, towards special education services that we have to provide. So I know we're supposed to say thank you for the investment, but we're also at the same time going, it better be a down payment with more to come. That's really the message I take.
Okay, Patrick?
Well, I'll continue with that theme a little bit. So we were really under the impression that this was the legislative session that special education would finally be addressed. You might recall, Deb, a few years ago when the McCleary fix happened, there was all sorts of changes to the funding formulas that go out to districts, and I think it was a good faith effort by the legislature to try and right some inequities that were happening out there. But they didn't touch special education. And we heard a lot of talk and promises and assurances, well, we'll address it this go around. And I think I may have mentioned this before, but there's 2 fatal flaws to the way that special education is funded. One is there's an artificial cap that they place on the number of students that they will fund that are receiving special education services. That cap is at 13.5%, and all of our districts have a higher percentage of our students receiving special education services than that. In Olympia, the most recent OSPI report card, we're over 17%. So that cap was something we expected to go away. What ended up happening is they did raise it immediately to 15%, but again, I believe we're all above that number. So it's helpful, but it doesn't get us to where we need to be. The other issue is this multiplier. So all students are general education students first, and then if they're receiving special education services, they get additional funds to pay for those services. Well, that multiplier that they've been using has been inadequate because we have many students in our district that have pretty profound needs that involves additional staff, technology, curriculum, and the multiplier has just been inadequate. And so we, as Brian mentioned, we subsidize special education out of our enrichment levy in the Olympia School District over $9 million last year. And this bill that passed is going to get us about 2.7 to 2.8 million. So it doesn't really get us but a third of the way there. So again, it could have been worse. We're thankful for what happened, but I agree with Brian's sentiment that it's a down payment, and it really is an immediate need. For us to say that, well, we can wait another year, we can wait another year. These are our most vulnerable, our most, students that need that support now. And so it was in some ways disappointing because some of the original bills that came out in the session were much more robust, where we were like, yep, that's exactly where we need to hit the target, and it got really reduced over time. So in that regard, the special ed piece was disappointing. On the regionalization side, Brian didn't mention it, but we've talked before about our districts are very connected. Deb would tell you that a few years ago when North Thurston got regionalization, which is an extra percentage above and beyond your apportionment from the state, 6%, which eventually whittled down at North Thurston. We were all like saying, that doesn't make any sense because it's supposed to be based on cost of living and whether or not you live in Tumwater or Yelm or Lacey or Olympia. We're so connected that it just seems crazy to me that any one of our school districts would get regionalization and the others didn't. And that happened with North Thurston before. Now North Thurston is losing regionalization and Yelm's getting it. And Tumwater and Olympia again are in the middle going, I don't understand. So on the regionalization side of things, I think that was disappointing. But I hate to say it, but it could have been worse. And so we are thankful for some of the things that came out of the session.
Before we go on then, can we just stick with regionalization for a second? Because I think our viewers may not have a clear understanding of what we mean. So, and let me share my perspective. So the state determines there's a funding level that comes from the state, and then based on criteria, I'm not sure what those criteria are, a district may get an additional percentage of funding for, for salaries and for general education.
Yeah, it's for some staff. It's for state-funded staff. It does not touch any staff that are levy-funded or staff that are federally funded.
Which would be?
A lot of special education in there.
About 20% of your district.
Yeah.
Local levy pays for anywhere from 15 to 20% of staff in our district. Yeah.
And it does not go to what we call MSOC, materials, supplies, and operating costs. It's just for a percentage, an average percentage of the salary of those employees.
Okay. And the whole idea is it's supposed to be based on cost of living. So if you live in the Seattle, Bellevue area, it might cost more here. So here's your apportionment from the state, like Brian described, and here's 18% more on top of that because the cost to rent an apartment or buy a house costs more there. And so in the outskirts of the Seattle area, you might see like 12% and then 6%. And again, North Thurston got that 6% in the past and then it got whittled down. And now Yelm's getting that 6%. North Thurston's losing it. And Tumwater and Olympia, where you go and you look at your price of your home and your property tax, you're going, I don't understand. Right. The cost of living doesn't make sense.
Cost about the same.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I interrupted you as you were getting ready to share.
That's okay. Back to special education, as my colleagues pointed out, Tumwater, we have over 15.5% of our population receives special education services. It costs the district an additional $2.2 million. And unfortunately, while we're grateful for the 15% cap, because we're getting closer, it still doesn't meet the need of our students and all the special requirements from each one of their individual education plans. And when it comes to regionalization, as my colleagues pointed out, we're in the same region, and yet Tumwater receives no regionalization dollars. So it's quite disappointing. So,
Deb?
So our numbers for special education are actually very similar to Olympia. We have locally funded about $10 million a year for providing special education services. And the legislative session just ended, and so we're in the process of identifying what the actual revenues are coming to us. And we anticipate it's about $2 million. So for special education, we're still $8 million funded out of local, out of the local levy. In terms of regionalization, I think what was surprising to us was that North Thurston not only declined, but the state law that created the expectation that rebasing would happen this year also stated that districts would not receive less than they had been receiving. So we had, as Patrick mentioned, we had started at 1.06 and had been reduced to 1.03. And in this legislative session, they accepted a continued reduction. So in 2 years, we'll be down to 1.0. So in this budget year, we're losing 1.5 million. And at the same time, we need to pay competitive salaries. And so the cost is not going down, but the funding is going down.
And 1.0 is 0% regionalization.
Yeah. So we will end up at 0, and Tumwater and Olympia at 0. You do have an experience factor coming through to Olympia that we do not receive. And Yelm went up, and it's based on the Department of Revenue calculation that has to do with, I believe, housing cost increases. So we need to better understand what's generating those formulas, because we have employees that live in our district and teach in Olympia or Tumwater or vice versa. It really is one community.
I remember back when the McCleary fix came out that we advocated very strongly to the legislature, don't do regionalization this way. Do not do it this way. It creates winners and losers, and it creates winners and losers within counties, and then it pits all of us more competitively against each other in the area of salary for our staff. We believe that part of the reason we got regionalization this year is more about what was happening in Pierce County calculations. We have one school that's in Pierce County, and you know, we're now a target where, and we have to now be competitive and compare to the salaries of our neighboring districts. As Patrick was saying, most of our teachers and our staff live in each other's communities, so it really doesn't make sense to say one funding formula here, one here, and two different kinds here. It doesn't make sense at all. But we don't think that there was significant thought and revision going into regionalization formula this year, and it certainly didn't come out in a way that's equitable for Thurston County.
Well, Bellevue, Issaquah, Kirkland, Seattle, they all have the same regionalization. They're all in that same area. And why would you come down and you come across Nisqually Bridge and you come here and you go, that district, but not these? Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. I read in getting ready for today's show, I was just reading through, some news reports and stuff, and I saw one headline that said the McCleary fix isn't, and so I was like, yeah, we've been talking about that. So,
and I do think so. Representative Beth Dolio recognized that the inequities that were occurring, and I do think that late in the session there was conversation about this, but I think it was too late, and so hopefully going forward there will be a priority on really examining the formulas that are driving out the result.
So let's talk about transportation. We know you've all had challenges, just literally having somebody behind the wheel of a bus, but there's a lot more to it. So let's talk about transportation and what legislation has done to that. Why don't we start with Carole on this one?
Right, there is some safety net money that that we're applying for, and in our superintendent's meeting this morning, I think we've all made application for that, and then what we're going to actually receive, we're finding that out as we go. So we've applied for about $404 million of $404,000, in safety net. But I'm hearing from colleagues that maybe we're only going to receive a small portion of that. So that would be disappointing if that's the case.
And that is to support literally hiring personnel, or?
I think that, so first we should describe the safety
Sure.
net is actually for additional transportation services above what would be considered the normal to and from school transportation. So our students who are identified as homeless, we try to keep the school setting as the most stable part of their life. And so when a student becomes homeless and they're a student in our district, if they ended up moving to Yelm or were displaced to the Yelm area, we would send a bus to go pick up the student to bring them to school. So that additional transportation cost is what would be applied for through this safety net
Right.
program.
Okay. And how is it impacting everybody else?
Well, last year was the first year that funding for transportation for safety net became available. And we have, as Carole mentioned, we've all been in the process of applying. And I think it's going to probably, like other state-run programs, it'll probably take a little while to make sure how we're collecting the information regarding the actual cost of providing that additional service is well documented in order to complete the application process. So it's my understanding that what we are receiving is way less than what we had applied for.
Exactly.
In this legislative session, I believe what they identified was additional funding to try to close that gap between what we're applying for, what we're qualifying for, and what we're actually receiving.
Our analysis is that we won't receive any additional funding in the transportation formula. And we transport students as far north as Tacoma and as far south as Chehalis and Puyallup. And that's McKinney-Vento homeless. That's also foster and special education. And we just don't believe that even with the new safety net process that will generate any additional revenue from what we have now.
We had a board work session last night talking about our budget and some reductions that we've had to make. We're all kind of going through that process, and we were talking about things like special education, how we subsidize it with our local levy. Transportation is another area where we get an allotment, but it doesn't quite cover it, and so we have to go into our local levy to pay for that. We're still sifting through the legislative changes to transportation and seeing if we might be able to get more funding. I will say, you started this, Deb, by saying sometimes it's just hard to get somebody behind the wheel. We've made some great strides in that area. I mean, we were canceling routes left and right a year or two ago, and we've trained up a lot of drivers. We've got some real dedicated, awesome folks that are doing that work, and I'm happy to say that our transportation system is not perfect, but is much, much better than when it was, and our routes are running much, much more consistently, and we're getting a better cadre of drivers coming in.
We've had very few canceled routes this year.
Good.
We're in the same boat.
Good.
We have not. We've had a lot of canceled routes, but we're getting better. And it does take a long time to get a bus driver certified to be able to be, on the road behind the wheel. So we've done a lot of that work, and we partner with North Thurston for our trainings. But yeah, we still don't have all the drivers hired that we actually need. So anyone out there who
An opportunity.
wants to be a bus
Here's
driver.
an opportunity. So, Patrick, you mentioned that you were talking about budget reductions in your board meeting last night, and the Olympia School District's budget has been pretty prominent. Yeah. Are you all facing things? I mean, will we maybe start with you on this? How is it?
We've talked about this quite a bit, and there's a little bit of a perfect storm that's happening. The McCleary fix from a few years ago, as Brian said, it created winners and losers. It neglected our ability to fully collect our local levy amount that our voters had approved for our school district. We're leaving money on the table. Again, good faith effort from the legislature to try and fix some inequities around the state, but it harmed us. We weren't able to use that local levy to the full amount. There were things like regionalization that we didn't get. Even though we do get an experience factor because we have very experienced teachers that cost more, if they would have left the system alone under the old mix factor, we would have more money than we do now. So all of those things from McCleary kind of were put on hold for a while during the pandemic because school wasn't running for almost a year. All sorts of things happened, and we were able to save some money, and there was this huge infusion of federal dollars to help us weather the pandemic storm and to get through it, and it covered up a lot of blemishes. So we were using that money to hire a lot of staff to come in and help with social emotional support, supplies for, pandemic mediation, in terms of equipment, masks, all that type of stuff to do that. So we had all of this money, which is one-time money. It's like a hurricane happened. Here's a bunch of money from FEMA, and it's all going away. So McCleary's coming home to roost. We got the federal dollars that are running out. And then in Olympia's case, and it's not exactly the same everywhere else, our enrollment's down. So since 2019-20, we're down about 740 students. So it's about 7 or 8% of our district enrollment, almost exclusively at elementary. When I first came to the community, our our kindergarten cohorts were around 700. They're more like 550, 560. There's just not a lot of births and new families moving into our area. So all of those things contributed to our current reduction needs. And it's been very hard. And I'll tell you, Deb, there's two things that happen during reductions, and I've done it in other districts. I've been a part of it. One is it's just excruciatingly hard because you have to cut programs, which is people, which people will come out of the woodwork to tell you how valuable that person was. So on the one hand, that hurts. On the other hand, you really hear what people value, right? You hear people saying, this is really important to my student. This is really important to my family. And there's a side of me, it's like, isn't that great, right? That people are coming in and talking about how impactful these amazing people are to their kids and their families. So it's been brutal. We're kind of right sizing, but because of our enrollment, which has been the main driver, but those other two factors have been contributing as well.
Have any of you found that enrollment changed and enrollment reduction has been directly attributable to parents homeschooling during pandemic and not bringing their students back into your school districts, or has that been a factor?
To a small degree, yes. We lost at the height of the pandemic maybe 330 students, and we got 2/3 of them back this year. Again, most of our loss was at elementary, where we saw families relocating to have multiple families come, 2 families, 3 families coming to live together maybe in a different community. We've had small recoveries in homeschool and online programs. Those students have gradually come back. The call to things like sports and activities has really, been a big draw in our community. So we have retrieved a lot of those students. So that makes our reduction just a little bit softer, even though we are in the process of reducing through attrition. And most of that, nearly all of that, is that one-time federal funding that we have to overcome in our budget next year.
Okay. Carole, how about for you?
So, yeah, well, there was a lot of heavy lifting the year before I came. And a lot of what my colleagues are experiencing now happened with the previous superintendent and his cabinet and the board. And so this year we're down about 130 students. And I think there is a really, a question about where I think people are relocating potentially out of state even. And we're trying to track a lot of that data. So this year we're able to make all the adjustments so far that we need to make through attrition, retirements, resignations, people who are relocating. And so again, I think the heavy lifting happened last year with the former superintendent and his team, and I really appreciate that because this is really hard work. When I've been in another district when we've had to riff and have a reduction in force, and it's very emotional all the way around. So I'm so appreciative of the work that was already done before I came.
Deb, how about North Thurston?
So we opened a couple of new schools intending to better serve families who wanted a different option. So we opened Ignite Family Academy. So families who wanted to keep their children home and continue to homeschool, who were probably first-time homeschoolers during the start of the pandemic, are enrolling in that program. That program has tripled in enrollment. And then Summit Virtual Academy is entirely online. We do some in-person connections for students, but their daily instruction is synchronous and online. And so we had huge enrollment during the pandemic, and a lot of families decided that that's their preferred learning mode for their student. It does require that the family identify a learning coach to be that adult supporting the student, but they're not responsible for the instruction the way that a homeschool family would be responsible for the core instruction. So we always do find out where our students are going. It's something as a public school system we're all responsible for. So if we have a sophomore in high school that ends up moving to Tumwater Schools, there's an electronic tracking of students. So we have done that with all of our students, and we have really good data where they've gone. And we are directly impacted by JBLM movement, and there will be times in the middle of the school year where all of a sudden we're enrolling a lot of new students, and it is the influence of JBLM families moving into the community. And that, when we look at where did students go from last year to this year, it was tied to movement out of the area. And so we have really good data, and I feel like the additional programs that we have created, those schools, are meeting the needs within for our parents, and they're continuing to be enrolled with us, just in a different program.
And you can track people within your system. What I can't track is people that have never come to our system, incoming kindergartners. Right. That's the hard part, right? So I can't say, why did our kindergarten class go down? We actually expect our middle school and high schools to be really full next year. I mean, they continue to be, the enrollment's fine. It's just at those lower grades. I mean, there is data in Thurston County about birth rates being down. And, you know, there is talk about cost of living in some of our areas, and if you are a new family. When we've asked people that were within our system why they left, most of them were, like Deb said, they moved. Some have gone to private schools, some have done some other things, some we just haven't been able to track down. But it really is those younger grades, which is worrisome because that bubble goes through the system, right? I'd much rather say, we're down in 11th and 12th grade, but kindergarten and first grade are really up. It's not that, it's the opposite. So we really have to have some conversations in Olympia about how many schools we have if the enrollment is not going to bounce back.
Does this look like 10 years from now?
Yeah.
I think one thing that we're all experiencing in our personal lives also applies to our school budgets, and that is costs are higher. And so we are, just like everyone in the area, looking at ways to reduce staffing through attrition. And it's because even though we are receiving more funding, it costs us more just to operate our programs.
So budget reductions, I mean, you may be receiving more money, but that doesn't necessarily mean your budget's going to cover everything. Right. So I want to make sure we get that. Budget reductions that you're facing in the upcoming school year?
Our overall budget, our expenditures will likely be very similar next year to this year. The problem with that is we will not have $4.4 million in federal money to add to that. So anything coming from the legislature has to backfill, and it doesn't. And so, we're chiseling down staffing positions. 85% of our budgets are staffing related, and little by little, but all through not replacing positions that have been vacated.
Just through attrition.
Yeah.
And
a lot of those ESSER-funded positions, which stands for Elementary Secondary Emergency Relief Funds, that's the federal money. A lot of that we did to support the social, emotional, physical health and well-being of our students. And it's, like I think we've said before on this show, Deb, the mental health and needs of our of our kids and our families didn't start with the pandemic. We have been understaffed in that area for a long time. So we really felt great that we could hire additional social workers, family liaisons at all of our elementary schools to help families in crisis and get resources in the community. We added instructional coaches, which is something that a lot of districts have done. We haven't done it in Olympia. And we added instructional coaches because I know one of the things we're going to talk about is the impact on learning. Right. But if you've got a real diverse set of experiences during the pandemic where kids are coming in at different levels of learning, that's probably the most difficult thing for a teacher is how do I make sure that I'm getting everybody when they're all at different levels? And so we brought in a bunch of coaches to do embedded side-by-side professional development to help do that work. That's going away. So our coaches are going away. Our family liaisons are being cut in half. Our nursing allocation that we really increased to have like 2 people in the health room when we were testing everybody and doing isolation rooms, we're going back to 1. And so all those things will be different next year. And people will feel it because you get used to that and it's nice to have that resource. In many ways it was necessary, but if you don't have the money. And our class sizes, we'll see them bump up a little tiny bit. Because of the legislative session, we got a little bit more money back and we immediately infused that back into the system. So I think that should be minimal, but it will be, when you have fewer staff, you do fewer things or they get done less quickly. That's what I think people will feel.
We did not hire additional staff with those ESSER funds for the most part. We did have a Department of Health grant where we had additional health personnel in all of our health rooms, and unfortunately that's going to go away. But just to reiterate, I think any of the added staff or personnel that were able to be helpful when they go away, we're really going to miss that. And so, but I think our budget will be pretty steady. And again, a lot of heavy lifting in the previous year, so I'm anticipating about the same.
And most of our ESSER funds are going for extended learning opportunities, summer programs, and that will just get spent down. We have budgeted through 2024 to offer those additional services, and we're required by state law to have a 4-year balanced budget, and we will bring a budget to our board like we do every year that will be balanced. As I mentioned, our expenses are going up. Revenue went up a little bit, but not as much as our expenses, so we'll just be tightening things up. We'll have positions that won't be filled. When you reduce through attrition, you don't necessarily choose exactly where that reduction occurs. What we have done since August is filled positions from within. So if we know, like we only have like 1 health room assistant in a building and that position opens up, we make a decision, that position is of the greatest need, we do need to fill it, we post it from within, and eventually there will be a position that won't be filled. And that's what people will feel.
And I think the trickiest part of that is we have some really hard to fill positions that we do have to fill in order to meet IEP requirements, those sort of things. So there are some of those that we do have to go outside that require certain certifications, et cetera. So that's also pretty challenging when we think about really tightening up budgets.
I was thinking of something that you said about the pandemic and what was the cause? Is that contributing to enrollment? And I do think certainly that there were some families that were worried about the vaccine, or maybe they had somebody immunocompromised in their house, and they didn't, all those types of things. And what we're realizing in Olympia in some instances is compulsory attendance law in the state of Washington starts at the age of 8. So you don't have to come to school when you're 5, 6, and 7. And what we are finding is, in addition to the academic discrepancies across the system, you're seeing a lot of behavioral types of things. And the social emotional, right? So I just got done talking about how we paid for a lot of social emotional support. We had a student arrive at one of our schools that's basically age-wise is a 2nd grader, showed up ready to put him in 2nd grade, kid had not been in school. And parents said we'd kept him home, and and there was a lot of, I've never done school before. So really trying to support that student, and that's not something that most 2nd grade teachers do, that they have a kid that comes in that's never done school before and needs all sorts of behavioral support in addition to the academics. So, like I said, this is going to hurt, that some of these people that we brought in to really support that social, emotional, behavioral support, we've reduced or cut back or in some instances eliminated. So I don't want to discount that, that people are concerned about. That's a legitimate concern.
I think it's really important to understand, for the people that don't work in education, understand the number of kids needing support. I don't know that it's dramatically increased from pre-pandemic levels. It's the level of support that is needed and the level of intervention that's needed that is requiring us to start our days differently, to engage different types of staff who are more well-trained and more able to deal with, severe anxiety, severe ideation, all those different things. It's a different way to start and work through the day, and that weighs on the whole system. And a lot of us invested in those higher trained or differently trained staff. Now that is one-time money that may not be or won't come again. So how do we find ways to absorb that through levy dollars or through, the little bits and pieces that we did get in this legislative session? That's going to be the hard part, because there's just no way. You never stop supporting kids, and you have to meet their needs. And right now, I don't see where going back to pre-pandemic staffing levels and pre-pandemic ideas is the way to go. So we'll have to continue to think through that differently.
I had a conversation with some educators in my family about this exact thing, that during the pandemic we had little ones who were kindergarten and first grade, where you learn these social skills and, we sit and we read, we don't get up and run around, that kind of thing, who were in front of a computer, for that incredibly formative part of their year. But then also the transition from elementary to middle school, and from those kids who were in those transitional moments were really impacted in a very different way than students who were kind of like in the middle, who took a year and did it in front of a computer and then went back to what they knew. So, and I think we just, it was a fascinating conversation that we, just in general, we were also concerned about being safe and healthy. That piece kind of, I'm sure parents were considering it, but just the general thought of, education, well, we've got them in front of a computer, they're learning something, but it's that other piece about how to maneuver in the world as you are in transitional times in your life, was really severely impacted for those particular kids.
Yeah, simple things like how to line up to go to lunch.
Right.
Or to go to your specials, or how to sit at a lunch table.
Right.
Or I just spent a morning with a student like Patrick described that hadn't been to school, and he really is age first or second grade, and had never been in a school setting and was used to a lot of one-on-one attention, and he's requiring a lot of attention to help him navigate the day and start to integrate into the middle of a school year. So
I think for the transition from elementary to middle school too, when many schools are coming together and you're meeting new friends and you're building a new cohort, that so many of our 5th into 6th graders didn't get that, and then their first year, they missed that piece. What a challenge. So
I would just share that. And we know they can learn it with the right support.
Absolutely.
And it does happen. And right now, if you go through visit our schools, you'll see students very successful in a classroom environment. So we definitely noticed that when we first came back in person full time, but we've already made the adjustment.
the other thing I would say, I think Brian touched on, is just activities. And our numbers are huge participation-wise.
they want to be
Thurston
with their
They
friends.
want to be.
It was something that
Yes.
students took for granted, and then when all of a sudden it was removed as an option, being able to participate in activities and athletics, they really are showing
numbers
up.
are way up.
Huge numbers.
So let's talk a little bit about the overcoming the pandemic learning loss, and student engagement, because we know students are involved in activities and stuff. How is that going? Because it was a big hurdle to get over. Let's start with you, Deb.
So the ESSER funds that we received, some of those funds were specifically to address the needs of students as we're coming back to school and out of the pandemic. And I already mentioned the summer program that we've run the last few summers, and we're geared up to serve close to 1,000 students again this summer. And we do pre and post assessments, and those programs have been very successful. Another program that I think I've mentioned previously, we're describing as Power Up, and it is using those ESSER funds, so they won't be here forever. Yet a classroom teacher can identify students within the classroom who are struggling and provide additional services for those students. So the teacher may choose to have a small group of students stay after school and receive some additional instruction. And the Power Up students, we're doing both pre and post assessments, and it's happening in a variety of ways in both ELA, math, and social emotional learning, and we're finding that the students are making significant gains. So that targeted assistance is really making a difference.
Similar to Deb, we have summer school plans for this summer and next summer, and have been doing that. We'll also, I think the phrase learning loss, I'd like it to go away because we're seeing growth and the kids are catching up. And so I think that for me personally, I'd like for that phrase to just be
Strike it from our
strike it from
vocabulary.
yeah.
Patrick.
The reason why I think we struggle with that is because kids were learning during the pandemic, right? There was certain learning that they weren't getting that we're probably all used to from our own school experiences. So there was some delays in getting that. It wasn't lost. There was all sorts of learning that was happening. And I agree with what Deb and others have said, that our assessments show great growth. I mean, our kids are incredibly resilient, and our staff are pretty darn amazing. They just have done a great job, and we've seen growth, particularly for some of our students who have historically, been challenged to kind of to meet certain standards. Students receiving special education services, students from low-income families, students that are receiving 504, which is kind of like special. We've seen more growth there than we've seen in other areas, and I think it's because we were really intentional about that during the pandemic. But what I would just say, since we're on this topic, and I know we're going to get to kind of the closing here in a little bit, is that while there are a lot of people that are coming back to school, the activities are really something that kids have thirsted for and really wanted to get back to, I'm going to continue to say that we are not going back to normal. School is forever changed. And for those of us that are maybe thinking we need to put everything back the way it was, that is a losing battle, and rightfully so. I think that really we are going to see a continuation of a transformation of our system, where we really have to ask ourselves, what is it that I'm asking this student to be present for in this classroom? Why must they be here? Because if we can't say it's really important for them to physically be in this room, people are going to choose not to be there. They're going to go do something else. I can't do virtual volleyball. I'm coming to the volleyball game. But I can read, Huckleberry Finn or whatnot. I don't need to be in the room to do that. So we really need to think about the content, how we deliver it. What are those things? We just had a conversation this morning about ChatGPT. Okay, I mean, so this whole idea that kids, need to sit down and they need to write this and do this, and when we got artificial intelligence that's doing things in such a way, we really need to rethink the way that we're doing. And we have teachers and principals and educators across the nation, and even within our systems, that are already thinking about this. Yes. And if we try and keep kids into something that we remember, we're doing a disservice. So I just think there's going to continue to be this sort of, this disequilibrium and uncomfortableness as we continue to change the system to be different when we were in school. And that's going to be a constant source of anxiety and problems for school districts around the area and for us right here in Thurston County.
Our fall to winter assessment data shows that our students are performing in excess of 2020. So now, is that across the board? In some aspects of our system, there are the gaps that we saw pre-pandemic might be bigger, and we have to do things differently to fill those gaps. But as a broad view, our students are performing better than pre-pandemic levels. I think some of the learning loss conversation may have started when our students came back. Our high school students struggled with credit earning. Okay, and attendance, and attendance and credit earning have really strong correlations. Our student attendance is back up over 90% this year. Our ninth grade data, which is a massive indicator of success through high school, shows that our ninth graders are doing far better in terms of course completion than pre-pandemic. That spells a lot of really great things for our system. Patrick is 100% right, though, that we have to, if classroom is where the magic is, if kids have the most impact when they're with their teachers, we have to make sure that what they're doing here on campus is the most impactful, is the most needed, is the most on target instruction. And it doesn't matter what we were doing pre-pandemic. It's what does that kid now? I think we have to revisit. How does a high school kid, do they really have to sit 90 days to earn a credit? Do they really have to sit 180 days to earn a full credit? They probably know more than that, and those barriers or those structures actually probably inhibit learning a little bit. So it creates exciting dialogue, but I do think our students are performing at levels that are in excess of 2020. And it's also that our students are far more desiring to represent their school and their community in activities, and that's sports, and that's we have 250 middle school kids out for a track this year in 2 schools. It's just amazing numbers, and that puts a lot of pressure in other areas. But we just have to be very focused on when they're with us, are we giving them the best product we can give them?
Well, we are coming very close to the end of the program, and I do want to make sure that we give Carole and Brian a few extra moments. So I'm going to start with you, Deborah, if you want to share a special highlight from the year.
So one thing that we have focused on is having reopening really our participation out in the community through community service. And we started a program with the Jubilee community, which is primarily a retirement community. And we call it Teen Tech Genius. Our students go and help seniors with their computers, with their technology. It's been really successful. I think for both the students to really feel like they know something that they can help someone else with, fills their cup and makes that intergenerational connection. It's been really positive.
I'm going to skip you and go to Patrick.
Highlights of the year, just any time I go out into a school, I mean, it's a highlight for me. Our students are doing amazing things. And one thing that was really cool is that last night before our board meeting, we had a little art exhibition, because we put a big decorative wall at the district office with tables with different artwork. And so one of my school visits earlier in the year, I'd gone out to Pioneer Elementary School and into their art classes. So a lot of the work that was on that wall, they were working on when I was in the classroom. And so a lot of the families were there that night kind of looking at the different artwork. There was a particular artist, and I'm probably going to get her name wrong. I think her name is Alma Thomas. Alma Thomas, but it's almost sort of like that Seurat, sort of dots and lines to make pictures. And the students were so excited, and their parents were so proud as we had these beautiful art pieces up on the wall, and they were talking about how they were going to frame them when they get home. But I'm going to say again, I can't do that digitally, right? That is the type of thing where those kids being in that classroom with that teacher, talking to one another, you don't do that on Zoom. Sharing different types of pieces, that is a meaningful, intentional, important thing to express all sorts of things through art. Was just a super cool highlight for me yesterday. And the only other thing I would say is track season is off and running, and we have two sisters at Capitol High School, the Mole sisters, Amanda and Hannah. They have world records in the pole vault. Last year, if they had been their own team, they would have finished third in state, those two young ladies, as a school. And so they are going to be doing some amazing things coming up along with all of our spring athletes. I'm looking forward to going out there and watch them.
Carole, you've only been with us for this school year, and we've really appreciated your efforts and appreciate your efforts on behalf of the students in Tumwater. So take a little extra moment to share some highlights from your experiences.
I would say that kind of the whole year has been a highlight. It's been just a really incredible year. And so one of the things I would highlight is we have student representatives, 3 on our board, and we've been highlighting students at board meetings. And so musicians, athletes, kids who take first in state, and so our last meeting were our dance team at Tumwater High, and then also we had a quartet come and play. So we featured musicians. We had a 5th grader come in and on the bass guitar did the national anthem. And we filled the whole boardroom and then some. We spilled way out this last meeting. And what I've heard from our student representatives and from the board members in closing comments, that those have been highlights for them as well. And so I've just really appreciated the community, the welcome that I've received. And so, but I'm going to go home after 6 years of living away from my home in Spokane. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for your service to the students in Tumwater and for joining us here at the roundtable. So we have 7 minutes.
Does that mean you want me to fill 7 minutes? Okay.
No,
because I can do it.
So I do want to give you, Brian, an opportunity, since this is your last visit here at the roundtable, but you're also going to be stepping into retirement.
Something, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard every day's a Saturday when you get to that point, but I don't know for sure.
That would be really nice.
I don't know for sure. So would you like to share some highlights, not just from this year, but from perhaps your experience as the superintendent for the Yelm Community Schools?
Well, it starts with 38 years went by in a blink of an eye. I can remember my first day, but 13 years with Yelm, 7 as superintendent, and there's just tons of highlights. I love being the high school principal. One highlight is in my 7 years, we've hired 50 of our graduates back into teaching positions, and about 35 of those were my students when I was their high school principal. So every time I go to visit a school, it's reunion time, and we have a lot of fun with that. I think one of the highlights that I really wanted to talk about today was, it just happened last week, is I started a superintendent advisory council this year. Our student reps on our board actually requested that we started that. We have 18 kids, grades 6 through 12. And for the past 2 months, they had engaged in listening events at their school, really talking about how do we get better? How can we make things better for students? And what is that student voice that will propel us forward? And so we took all of those suggestions, we organized them into themes, and the students started processing the themes. And the theme that they chose as their #1 topic was, how do we increase mental health supports for our peers? And so the kids sat down, and it was an amazing experience where the 3 adults that were facilitating, we just stepped back and we just listened. And the kids were so energetic, so collaborative. They came up with high quality, creative ideas about how do they get the message out that people are here for them, people care about them, there are resources. There was great discussion. I didn't know we had that. How did you know we had that? And we were just talking about, they got onto how do we onboard new students into our system better, because everybody needs to know about these things. The energy level was off the chart. And I just kind of sat back and reflected that that's amazing transition over 38 years, that we're getting to the point where student voice is an incredible propeller for change. And it doesn't have to be protests and anger. It's about letting the kids collaborate and letting them talk about the things that they believe in passionately. They want better schools. They want to have their voice heard. And the more we listen to them, the better off it is. I think you said something a little bit ago, Patrick, that we can't be creating the schools we went to. We have to be creating the schools that kids need and want to go to. And it was just so fun. Our student board reps, there were 4 of them there, and they just embraced the middle school kids. It was every idea is a great idea. And then they funneled them down to some idea. And then we'll launch a product next month. That really is a campaign about if you need help, there's a lot of things for you, and the kids will be taking that to their peers, and it'll be a nice product. But just working with kids never gets old, and that's what I'll take away from it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your 38 years. Is that what you said, of service to students? And for your time here at the Roundtable. We've really enjoyed having you with us. Thank you so much. If you are the parent of a preschool-aged child, please read with your child 20 minutes a day. It's one of the best things you can do to get them ready for their education. And while you're at it, try some counting and number games to get them a little bit interested in math. If you're the parent of a school-aged child, get involved with your child's education. The school principal or website can provide you with information about opportunities to volunteer and support your student. We're headed into the summer, so try to keep your kids reading during the summer and involve them in creative activities throughout the summer to keep them active and engaged. So we say goodbye to the superintendents for this school year, and especially thanks to Carole, and again thanks to Brian. And ask you to join us again in the fall when the Superintendents Roundtable returns. There'll be a couple of new faces. We'll see you then.